what I'm going to be talking to you about is the title of my talk here, From Leading Edge to Mainstream Practice, Incorporating Technology into Teaching and Learning. And to just highlight that I am an academic programming appointment. And the first couple slides, what I'm going to do, just to sort of explain what's going on, and I took a bit of sort of guidance from looking at Jen's talk last year, sort of looking at, there aren't a lot of academic programming appointments, and you might not see a lot of sort of pre-tenure talks for academic programming people. So, might need a little bit of explanation just so that you know what I'm talking about and why this is relevant to sort of what we're talking about today. So, 2010, the faculty agreement added academic programming appointments, and the sort of verbiage there, if you sort of refine it down, it's that there is a need in larger universities for teaching dedicated faculty as much as there's a need for more research-centered faculty. And in order to accommodate faculty doing more research, they might need to have some sort of, lightening of their teaching load, and that's where the academic programming positions really sort of come in. But the faculty agreement isn't a real fan of having faculty who don't do any kind of research, so they put some limits on this. And they said that there could only be 50 academic programming appointments on campus out of 1,100 or more faculty right now, which means that we are in the vast minority. Less than 5% of the faculty will ever be academic programming. And in order for any department or college to hire academic programming faculty, they had to have their own tenure and promotion guidelines. So it wasn't until 2012 that the College of Medicine actually had their own guidelines and was able to start hiring academic programming people. Looking at the range of duties, most sort of faculty, at least in the College of Medicine and the basic sciences, fall under the sort of scientist realm here. So, they can have a high amount of teaching. Typically, that's a little later in their career. Early on in their career, they might have very little teaching sort of requirements. So the maximum, still sort of hits about 50%. Big differences, Category 4, research and scholarly work. Academic programming appointments aren't your typical researchers. But what we do have are our practice of professional skills sort of set here. And the practice of professional skills set is actually split into sort of two different things. The 5.1 being sort of just things related to your teaching practice, overseeing courses, doing course design, things like that. And the 5.2 is a sort of research category. So looking at the tenure guidelines and sort of figuring out all the things I need to do this year, or this upcoming year, in the tenure guidelines for academic programming appointments, there's two things. One, I need to make a written statement, which we don't need to go over right now, but an open seminar that outlines the candidate's academic program. You say, well, what does outlining the academic program mean? If you're a researcher, it makes sense. You talk about the various papers that you've published and the grants you've gotten and things like that. But if you are teaching-centric, it's a little bit different because your academic program is sort of wearing many different hats, sometimes simultaneously. So my academic programming practice, if we sort of list the various things that I do, it's nicely sort of set out in the tenure guidelines of things that need to be checked off of this list. So 5.1, academic programming practice, things that foster learning, so things sort of related to teaching, curriculum development, mentorship and advising, educational administration and leadership, learner assessment, and then 5.2, that 5 to 10% is scholarly work, publications, presentations, instructional innovations, mentorship, advising, scholarship awards. So I could talk about lots of different things, but I wouldn't be able to give you a lot of detail about it. So what I'm going to do is really talk about the parts of my academic program that deal with teaching with technology. And the things I've got highlighted in stars, they're all things that are sort of places where I incorporate technology into my teaching and into my pedagogy. So things that I do, pilot new technologies on campus. I'm an early adopter. If there's anything that I see sort of coming that I can incorporate into my teaching, I am more than willing to try it out. This room actually is not equipped with wireless presenting, but some of the rooms on campus are starting to be, so being able to hook up your computer and walk around the room as you're using it is sort of some of the newest things that are available. I have, in the College of Medicine and the Guanama Center of Teaching and Learning, demonstrated technologies and actually helped to mentor people in sort of using them and giving them best practices. I've served as an advisor for Information and Communications Technology, or ICT department in Guanamas, for when they were looking at a new system for student response systems, sort of getting rid of the old Turning Point clickers. The lecture recording system next fall, potentially, they're looking at completely revising the lecture recording system and had me come in to look at various vendor demos to try and look at which system might be best or sort of suit the needs on campus. Active learning spaces design, which is sort of different people on campus come and they say, we are gutting this room in geology and what should we put in there to make it a better active learning space. And the sort of scholarship of teaching and learning with technology being a few studies that I've done to actually look at integrating technology into teaching and look for its effectiveness. So that brings us to the sort of crux of the talk, which is going to be how I've integrated technology into my teaching for the last 10 years. Now, to start off, you could say, well, where did it all begin? And this is before I started here, but it's sort of a natural progression of where I started with teaching, sort of getting up to what I use in the modern day or the current time. So 2006 was my first actual teaching position, and this was before I'd completed my PhD. My wife had twins, and her maternity leave had started early, so the twins were about, 7, 8 months old. She was off maternity leave. She wasn't going back to work. I was a teaching assistant and grad student, and essentially we had very, very little income. So I started adjunct teaching while I was finishing up my PhD. And it was a huge switch from when I was a student. Every single class I took was overhead projector. Potentially, maybe someone was using a slide projector. Nobody was using PowerPoint when I was an undergraduate student. And suddenly, everyone, it seemed, who was giving lectures was starting to use PowerPoint. And it at least made sense that if I'm going to generate new content, making it digitally, is just something that I can reuse and revise as opposed to going to, making my own overheads and slides and things like that. One of the problems that I quickly found out was that when you're using PowerPoint, it's so easy to go way too fast. You can have way too much content on the screen, you can read through it really fast, and you aren't really matching the student's pace of retaining that information and writing that information down. So I found, sort of introspectively and looking at what I was doing, I was going way too fast, and I had way too much content, and quite often I would run out of slides before I was done lecturing for the day. So I would sort of prepare 30 slides and say, okay, that's going to be an hour worth of content, and I would go through it in 35 minutes and be like, well, that's all I have prepared for today. I guess I could ask if you have any questions and things like that. So technology can be a bit of a crux. It can be a bit of a problem that it gives you those difficulties of being able to sort of properly deliver content. So the next semester, when I was adjunct teaching again, I started using my old MP3 player. I guess it was a new MP3 player at the time, but it had a digital voice recording feature. And what I started doing was thinking about my teaching as not just me delivering content, but me being able to iterate my teaching and reflect upon my teaching and do, a better and better job. And I was making these recordings just for myself. I wasn't giving them to the students. I wasn't posting them online or anything like that. I was just making these recordings so in the same way that any sort of athlete would look at their own game films and look to see, how did I fumble or, how did I miss that shot? Being able to say, how did I cover that? Did I, was I speaking well? Was I going too fast? What sort of, do I say okay every time I flip to the next slide? Something that became very apparent. I would flip to the next slide and go, okay. So this is what's on the next slide. Because it was all brand new content to me. So I also started using YouTube to look at what good lecturers were doing, what good professors were doing, because they would be very experienced, and lectures were starting to be posted online. 2007 to 2009 was when I went to Chicago, and there were a few technologies that I sort of inherited from the previous instructor at Trinity. So there were things like, being able to actually have a remote to flip from one slide to the next so that I could be working on the blackboard or whiteboard and not have to continually walk back to the computer to advance the slide. And this is great for sort of a timing sort of thing, so I don't need to be continually moving back and forth. But one of the things that I really sort of felt unhappy with is that all the stuff that I was putting up on the whiteboards and all the stuff that I was putting up on the blackboards, especially when I was doing things like teaching genetics courses and going through Punnett squares and things like that, there was a lot of content that I was putting up on the blackboard that was not archived. If a student missed the class, there was no way that they could see that content unless they were copying someone else's notes. But another student's notes are not always a true representation of what we covered in class. So in 2009, when I was hired here at the university just as a lecturer position, and my initial role was just going to be teaching, there was really no sort of concept of an administrative role or research or anything like that. It was just essentially, you're here to teach for the next 3 years. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to look at the various technologies that I might be able to incorporate into teaching to sort of satisfy my need for wanting to archive everything and being able to give it to the students in whatever sort of online avenue they might have for accessing. So I looked at things like lecture captures, I looked at things like on-screen annotation, using clickers or student response systems and social media as different ways to actually get content out to the students. Because this is a sort of best practices and things that worked and things that didn't, I'll sort of go through a couple of these things fast. For lecture capture, there's a number of different software sort of systems that you can, or software programs that you can utilize to do lecture capturing. And some of them are open source and they work okay, and some of them are commercial and they have more features. And what I selected was this software called Camtasia Studio. And here's just what a window from Camtasia Studio looks like once I've finished a lecture recording. So it is a quite full-featured video recording, video editing software, if you've ever used any video editing software. You can add multiple video streams in, you can change the volumes of the audio streams, you can sort of shift things back and forth. You can put in secondary audio streams if you want to. If your computer was playing a video, that's recorded as one audio stream, but you can also record the audio, off of your mic and sort of merge those things together. And you can also cut out things like empty space. If you're asking a question and there's 5 minutes of just dead air, you can sort of trim that out. Or if class starts a few minutes late because there's an announcement for, the Biochem Students Association or something like that, you can cut that off as well so that students don't have to sort of revisit all of that. The sort of product of that is something that looks like this. So with this software, it actually takes a screenshot of every time you move forward in a slide in PowerPoint, and it uses these to essentially create chapters in the video. So that if I was a student and I was saying, I don't want to look at the whole video of lecture 5 again, but I want to see slide number 10, because that's the content that I was a little confused on. You can sort of pull up these thumbnails on the side and select which slide you want and immediately sort of dive into the video at that point. Another thing that was sort of being used was I was putting these files up on Blackboard. Initially, I was just putting the video file up on Blackboard. A couple of years later, copyright regulations said that you can't have downloadable video content of your lectures. It has to be streamable. And it was sort of a simple switch to just sort of change the way that the video was wrapped up and make it streamable. And the other thing was that the university in 2009 had just started using a service called iTunes University or iTunes U. So if you think about how people in 2009 were using computers, desktops were still very much in use, laptops not quite as much, especially in class. Smartphones people did not have very much, data plans were very small, and content was typically something that people downloaded and then took somewhere else. So at iTunes University, the concept was people with iPod MP3 players could hook up their iPod to their desktop computer and download that lecture video and then watch it at their leisure, or maybe not leisure, watch it when they're trying to study. And iTunes U was a complete failure. My course and a Vet Med micro course were the only two courses that ever used iTunes University. And looking at the number of hits each lecture video was getting when I was putting up on Blackboard versus iTunes University, less than 5% of the hits were from iTunes. So I stopped using it, and eventually the system the whole university stopped using it. It was one of those sort of great things that might be really useful, and then suddenly, other systems are more useful. Just putting it up on Blackboard is so much more effective than putting it into this sort of iPod-centric sort of ecosystem. Because I was going to be doing these lecture recordings, I thought, it would be great if everything that I ever drew or wrote down, definitions, various figures that I'm reproducing as I'm talking, things like that, if they could be rendered digitally instead of putting them up on a Blackboard or a whiteboard, that was sort of my sort of best case situation. That's what I really wanted to do. So when I started here, people had just started producing what were called tablet PCs. And tablets is now something completely different from these tablet PCs. But essentially, it was a laptop that the screen could flip down or flip around, and it came with a pen so that you could write on it. It was also touch sensitive. So 2009 touch sensitive laptop screens were something that were very much sort of just coming about. So I said, okay, PowerPoint In 2007, just added the ability to ink onto their slides. Computers are coming out that actually have pens built in, so I can actually write onto my PowerPoint slides and save all of that. And initially, I was doing all of the audio recording from the computer itself. And within the first week, it was really apparent that every time I write on the screen, you could hear the pen scratching over top of the audio. And if I was moving around a little bit, because I sort of pace around a little bit, if I turn away from the computer and turn back towards it, you would miss things that I'm talking about. So I started using a secondary audio recorder, which is, of all the technology that I've started using, this is the only one that I still use today and haven't sort of just gotten a newer model, because all it does is record audio. There's no sort of fancier way of doing it. It saves things as an MP3. And after I do the lecture recording, I plug this into the computer, drag the file over, and sort of put it into the timeline, synchronize it, and produce this video. So this little snapshot, this is the first slide I ever presented here at the University of Saskatchewan, September 3rd, 2009. And you can imagine how nervous I was thinking about, is all of this technology going to work simultaneously? Are things going to crash? And they definitely did. In the early sort of times, there was incompatibilities where if I was still doing a lecture recording when I unhooked the monitor cable or the cable for the projector, everything would crash and I would lose that recording because it just wasn't working very well. But I quickly learned, how to make the system work, and there were less and less lecture recordings that were completely lost. The nice thing about having this sort of secondary audio as well was that if I lost the video, the audio was still there. So there was still something that students could start to use. If you want to look at how I've sort of progressed in doing these drawings on screen, this is a slide from Biochem 300 where we're talking about DNA replication. And typically in the sort of first slide of every lecture, I go over a review of the stuff from the previous day. And I find this is a great opportunity to draw things out, sort of bring in the various concepts from the previous lecture, sort of build things up in this nice large screen so that students can see it. And I can also talk about it as I'm drawing it, and the students can be thinking about it. And it's just a good way to have that sort of everyone paying attention to the same thing and thinking about the same process at the same time, as opposed to just flipping through figures where you're not even sure what students are thinking about. The other thing I wanted to do, because I was thinking a little bit ahead of time, and I was thinking, if I'm putting my lectures up online, and everything that I say, and everything that I draw, and everything that I show is in this video file that I'm putting onto the internet, putting onto Blackboard, why are students going to come to class? If I was a student, and it was an 8:30 class, which it was at the time, I would sleep in, watch the video in the afternoon, and essentially have the same experience. So I was sort of proactive in saying, I'm also going to use a student response system, or typically just referred to as clickers, and this is the student response system that the campus had just started adopting. Very few courses were using clickers at the time, but the lecture halls were at least being outfitted with the receivers so that if you wanted to use clickers, the room would do it. Turns out because I was using my own computer, I had to buy my own USB stick to use because that's something else that, it all needs to be in one system. And the nice thing about these is that you could ask questions embedded into the lecture. So, get 5, 6 slides in, and suddenly there could be a multiple choice question, asking them about, is this gram positive or gram negative, asking them, do this buffer calculation. And the questions had to be multiple choice or true false because it was all embedded onto this pin pad. A, B, C, D, or 1 or 2 for true or false, whatever the case may be. Because students, I figured, probably wouldn't want to use this system or buy these clickers unless they were forced to, I also said that this was going to be worth 5% of the grade in the course. It's not a lot, but looking at the literature and seeing that, having a little bit of an incentive to actually make the students use the system, once they start using it, they're fine to sort of continue on with it. But saying, no other course you've ever taken is using clickers, I want you to spend $50 on this little piece of hardware, they need some reason initially to sort of make that worthwhile. Benefits of using clickers, it's a great way to increase attendance because they're getting those marks for attendance and engagement. Increased engagement, you can get them to actually think about the content. You get to take that sort of mental break where in the middle of a lecture, suddenly they aren't just in that sort of write down everything the professor is saying mode. They can start to sort of, think about what did I just write down? I need to analyze this material. I need to answer this question. And that sort of brings them back and sort of increases their attention span once you get back to lecturing again. And you can also get instant feedback from the entire class. It's not just asking a question to the class and having one or two people put their hand up or say something, and then the next class, the same one or two people answering the question again. But you can actually get everyone answering that question and see that, where are those problems or where are those things where I need to go over that content again to sort of clear up any misconceptions. The other thing that I started using was social media, and I figured, it would be a great way if the students could have an opportunity to ask me questions in lecture. And when I was a student, I never would have put my hand up to ask a question because I was much too sort of introverted and shy. And I thought, you know what? If students had a way to send me a message while I'm lecturing, I've got a phone, I'm hooked up on Twitter, they could send me a tweet, and it would be essentially anonymous if they wanted to. They could just be anyone, any account. It doesn't need to sort of be tied to their name, and they could send me a message. And in 2009, nobody used Twitter, and nobody ever wanted to. I got maybe each term that I was using this, 5 students out of 160, 130, sort of depending on the enrollment, who was using this, and I also thought, this is a great way to send announcements out to the class. A few years later, Blackboard started sort of embedding that announcement feature so that I could send students emails and I could send students texts to all their phones through Blackboard, and suddenly Twitter was something that just wasn't used anymore. It has a great sort of usefulness for if you go to a conference and you can have sort of Twitter back channel, you can have people talking about the content and things like that. But for a large lecture classroom, it's not really that useful because the students are paying attention to what I'm saying. They're not really thinking about conversing with each other about that content. So those are all the technologies that I started with in 2009. And going into, a few years later, I'm always looking at, well, what other things can we do with technology? Because, I'm a geek, I'll admit that, and sort of anything that I can use a computer for seems like a lot of fun. We were doing the labs for BMSC 240, and if you've been to the BMSC 240 labs up on the second floor, it's a large lab room that accommodates 80 students. Typically, we have 4 teaching assistants, which means each TA has 20 students that they're responsible for. And at the start of the lab, typically they would do demonstrations of how to load a gel, how to run a chromatography column, how to do a plasmid isolation, or whatever the case may be. And what we noticed in those first couple terms is that some of the TAs were really experienced at each technique, and they did a great job of demonstrating it to that group of 20 students. Other TAs might have been coming from a different discipline. We might going over, how to streak a plate, and they are biochemists who have never done that before. They might be, great lab scientists, but they might not have that particular skill. So they weren't always translating the information we needed to the students. And the other thing is, with 20 students circled around one TA, they aren't always getting the best view of what's going on in that person's hands because some of them are sitting a little further away or they're off to the side. So we started using in the labs video tutorials, and we sort of authored our own video tutorials. And initially we only did 3. And we did them for, I think, streaking a plate, doing a gram stain, and running a gel or something like that. And the year after that, we made another 10 video tutorials, so we now have a total of 13. And these are all up on YouTube. We use them at the start of the lab, so if we're going to be running a gel, we show the how to run a gel one. And it gives us this nice consistent experience where every student is seeing it from, the perspective of standing right there watching someone load a gel, not from 20 students away. Also, because they're on YouTube, students can watch them if they want to for review later on. And it turns out that the ACB and micro labs in the 300 level use these as reviews. We haven't really used them in the Biochem 310, 311 labs, but if anyone wanted to, they're on YouTube for you to sort of show. And it's just a great way to sort of refresh any technique and sort of see it from a nice perspective. So 2012, I was rehired, as it were, as an academic programming appointment. And I was pretty comfortable with the teaching role and having an expanded teaching role and taking on, another course to be teaching and things like that. Administratively, I was already on a few committees, so that sort of made sense. But the big sort of fear, the thing that made me feel just like this, was suddenly I need to be doing research as well. And it wasn't, okay, order the fruit flies I was using in my PhD and start doing crosses again and extracting DNA. This was teaching research, or research into the scholarship of teaching and learning. So this was, for most faculty, you do your PhD, you're a really good researcher, and then you get a job in academia and you have to learn how to teach. So I went from being a researcher, learning how to teach, to suddenly having to think about how to do research into teaching. And it took a while going to Guanamos, having various courses and tutorials about what is the scholarship of teaching and learning, and realizing that it is a very different field. It's a social science as opposed to sort of biological sciences like we're used to. But I came up with, over the last 5 years, 2 projects that I've worked on looking at the effectiveness of using technology in teaching. So the first project was a retrospective project. So just looking at previous offerings of the BMSC 240 course and looking at, do student response systems actually bring up attendance? And if they do, how does this correlate to just having the material online? So what I wanted to do is look at, what are the reasons that people come to class? And this isn't anything that I sort of figured out. This is something that's in the literature. Things that increase enrollment or increase attendance in class, having an active participating class, class that is found to be engaging. The smaller the class, typically the attendance is higher because, for one, you notice if students are missing. People are less willing to skip class if they know that the professor is going to notice that they aren't there or they aren't showing up. If the information is current, or if it's applicable, or if in the lecture it clarifies the material that they can get somewhere else, these are reasons students come to class. Why don't students come to class? Well, if the lecturing is passive, if it's essentially just reading off the slides the same content that's in the textbook, suddenly students are like, well, why am I showing up if I'm getting the exact same thing as reading the textbook myself? The larger the class, the less people will attend because they figure, what, I'm just a face in a crowd. There's, if I'm not there, I'll just get notes from a friend. Lectures, if they aren't perceived as valuable because the content is somewhere else, if it's low quality in any way, so if it's not loud enough or it's potentially too loud, if it's too complicated, if I'm teaching at too high of a level or if too basic a level, students say, what? This isn't really matching the sort of expectations on the exam, so there's a lot of stuff I don't need to pay attention to, or it's just too boring. These are reasons students aren't coming to class. Conflicts are things that we can't really get around. If a student has a midterm, the lecture after mine, I have that expectation that students might be skipping class so that they can be studying and preparing for that one. Inconvenient lecture time, lectures in the evenings or lectures in the early morning, you're going to have more students not showing up. And illness, obviously, is a reason people aren't going to be coming to class. So what I wanted to look at was using all of these technologies, putting up these lectures online, are students getting the exact same experience? Are they performing at the same level? Or do the students that opt out of clicker usage, which essentially means they are not attending, are those students doing less well? So looking in the literature, we can see that there is a positive effect for attendance on student performance. I'll show sort of a figure from literature showing that. Another thing that I found out, because I was very interested in knowing, well, are students coming to my class as often as they come to other large lectures? In the literature, for classes of 100 students or more, typically 60 to 80% is a typical attendance rate. So I wanted to know, should we enforce attendance or should we give incentives for attendance, even if we're giving incentives not to come to class by putting those lectures online and things like that. So here's just a sort of large study that was done to look at performance versus attendance, and what we can see is that, going from attending 0 to 100% of the lectures and getting a grade of 0% to 100%, the more classes you attend, typically the better you do, and that makes pretty good sense. Obviously, there's going to be a sort of spread in the data that you might have students who don't go to class, but they've taken another course previously that they didn't get transfer credit for, but essentially they've got a lot of that background knowledge, or maybe they're just really good at studying from a textbook, and you might have students do really well. And also students might go to every single class and just not perform very well because that's their level of aptitude. So looking at, going from oral lecturing to putting notes online to getting to things like video podcasting really gets us what's called a hybrid course or an asynchronous course, where students are able to get that content not in the lecture room, but getting exactly the same experience or very close to the same experience from their home computer or whatever the case may be. So for Biomedical Sciences 240, every time I uploaded lecture videos and lecture notes, I always turned on the tracking feature in Blackboard, which would give me counts of how many students were accessing each PDF or each video file, and also what time they were accessing, and also what day they were accessing. So I had this large mass of data available on Blackboard that I could pull in and tie into my attendance data from using the clickers to look to see, do the students who show up do better when even when they skip class, they can still see and watch the same lecture. So here's one figure that shows that I do still see a positive correlation between attendance and performance. So looking at attendance, this is essentially sort of the number of videos, or sorry, not number of videos, number of clicker questions that they answered. So 26 lectures, 25 lectures for a Tuesday, Thursday class, minus a midterm or two, minus the first lecture where I tell the students we're going to be using clickers, generally gives us about 22 lectures worth of data. So looking at, are they attending all or none of the classes? And overlaid with their grade, all these students down here would be, for this sort of set, the students who opted out of attendance. So I had no clicker data for them. So essentially, they were free to not attend the class as much as they wanted to. And looking at the average attendance, 76.4%, that falls nicely between that 60 to 80. So I was using the clickers and getting the same sort of attendance levels that you would expect with a large lecture class, even though everything that I was presenting was being put online later. Splitting the two groups of the students who were using the clickers and the students who weren't, or essentially the students who were attending class and the students who weren't, what we can see is that there was a positive skew in the students' grades when they were attending class, even though the students who were not coming to class could get exactly the same lecture experience. Everything that I said, everything that I drew, everything that I presented, they could watch in that video, and there was essentially nothing that they would have missed, except they aren't paying attention. They aren't dedicating that hour and a half twice a week to focusing only on that lecture content and not upon, all the other things that they might be doing when they're watching those lecture videos at home, going to get a snack, petting their dog, watching TV, who knows what they might be doing. Something that I continually show to my class or tell to my class every semester is that if you look at the proportion of students that fail, students are 4 times more likely to fail the course if they opt out of attendance. So just by coming to class, you are increasing your chances that you are going to pass the course. Because being there, sitting in that room, you are going to focus your attention on what I'm presenting. Also, at least in this sort of range of the data set, there was never a student who got above 90% who opted out of attendance, who just said, I'm just going to watch the lecture videos and I'm not going to come to class. Whereas about 5% of the class who were coming to class were getting above 90%. I also want to know how the students were using the various content that I was putting up. So I actually put up 3 different files for every lecture. The first file I put up is just a print off of the PowerPoint that I have planned for the day. And these are my unannotated slides. They don't have any drawing on it, so they have gaps in the knowledge of things that I'm going to be filling in as I'm teaching. And this is what I consider the pre-lecture notes. And what you can see is that every Tuesday, every Thursday, or maybe the evening before, students are accessing this. So we're sort of getting this sort of every week, this peak up and down, which shows that students are accessing the content. The post-lecture annotated notes, after I'm done lecturing, I save all of these drawings and I print these off and I put it up again for the students so that they can have a static file that has all of the stuff. They don't need to review the video. And these, I thought, students would be accessing again in sort of a weekly or every lecture fashion. But it turns out the students were only accessing these at 3 times through the year. Just before the first midterm, just before the second midterm, just before the final. So the content was there. They were taking their own notes, but they were going to look to see when they were studying, what did Dr. Anderson write on this slide? I want to review that again because I want to make sure that my notes are correct. And there wasn't this typical sort of using it every single lecture. In the lecture videos, the same thing. There was some background viewing here, some students who would be watching all the way throughout the semester, especially those ones who were not attending class. But the bulk of the views would be before the first midterm, before the second midterm, and just before the final, showing that these videos are really a studying tool. The students aren't using them as a tool to avoid going to class. Looking at how many views a student has versus their attendance, I wanted to see if there was a trend where the students who aren't coming to class watch more videos, or the students who are coming to class, maybe they watch lots of videos as well. And there was really no good correlation at a per student level. Some students who attend every single lecture also watch over 100 lecture videos. Some students who attend no lectures might watch 90. But the bulk of the students here are watching the lectures and either coming or not. And it's just sort of all personal preference. You know, they might watch a lecture once. Some students might watch a lecture multiple times. If we look at the sort of median values here, though, for students who are coming to class, they only watch about 1/3 of the lecture videos to 1/2 of the lecture videos. Students who are not attending were watching just about all of them. They average about 21 with 23 lectures in this semester of sort of looking at the data. If you look at views versus grade, you know, are the students who view the videos more often doing better? There's really no correlation here. It's almost like random. The correlation coefficient here, 0.0027. So, you know, no real trend up or down between viewing the videos and having a better grade, because it was really about being in lecture where we saw that positive correlation. So this really informed my teaching because it was telling me how the students were using the videos. Going into this, I would have figured that they were watching them after every lecture, and that students would have been not just using them as a review tool, but using them as a sort of continual knowledge tool. So, and the student comments really sort of show this out, in that they were available for help with studying, just sort of saying podcasts were really useful, really useful. Without the podcast, studying would have been very difficult. It's just a way to sort of refresh your mind. If you weren't paying attention for 5 minutes during that lecture, you can cue that in and, you know, revisit essentially the same experience. But going to the lecture had that nice positive impact. My second project that I started to do a few years ago was sort of thinking about, with the scholarship of teaching and learning and being someone who's not, I'm not in the College of Education. I'm not going to make up a sort of artificial teaching project where I bring students in, I teach them one way, I bring another group of students in, I teach them a different way, and I look to see which way was better. Really, when I'm teaching for real all the time. So I always want to do the best job. So the opportunities for looking at changing things that I'm doing in teaching, and did these have a positive effect, need to sort of come naturally. And one of those sort of natural transitions was I started using a different student response system. So the initial student response system that I was using was your typical hardware clicker. And in 2014, in November, the top hat people started coming on campus looking for people to buy into their new student response system, which was a software-based student response system. So what I wanted to do, because I already planned on transitioning from one system to the other, I wanted to survey my class and actually do sort of a formal observational study of, do they learn better, or are they more engaged when I use this second system compared to the first? I'm not just sort of swapping back and forth from one system to the other, one lecture at a time. I was going to be committing fully to using this new system and making my students commit fully to using this new system and looking to see what their perceptions were. So the clickers that I started or had been using since 2009, last time I used them was the fall of 2014, because in winter 2015 is when I started using this new system. If you want to think about the features of this system that make it a good system, it's adopted widely across campus. People still use them today. It's still built into the lecture halls. Technically, it's really simple. You push a button, it records your answer. The students don't need to have a lot of technological knowledge to use these clickers. Cost was initially something students complained about, but after they were all using them in their first year courses, by the time they got to BMSE 240, nobody complained about using the clickers, and nobody even asked about how to use them anymore because it was something they were just used to. Suddenly the cost wasn't a factor. Also, they can resell these things. They could just sell it to someone else when they graduate and get maybe $30 for it or something like that. The big problems that I had going into these clickers, and I can tell you that using these term after term, I really became dissatisfied with the quality of the questions that I could ask with the student response system. It was always multiple choice or true false. I couldn't really ask them to engage the material and come up with their own unique answers because it had to be something that they could click on this pin pad. Another problem was that all of the questions, once they're done, they're there in the video or they're in the PowerPoint, but students can't see a list of all the questions when they're actually trying to study for the midterm or study for the final. So going to the second system of Top Hat, it actually had these additional features that looked to make it more effective. So Top Hat is now used across campus. It's actually been adopted for a campus site license, and when the ICT and Guatemala people were looking at the various software-based student response systems that people were using on campus, I was the champion of the Top Hat system, and I demonstrated it to the various sort of group that were actually looking at I think we went through about 4 or 5 different systems that people had been using on campus trying to select what might be the best one. But it's a browser-based interface, so I need to go from PowerPoint to a web browser and then open up the question. Great thing about that is that I don't need to have something plugged into my computer. I can't forget that if I go to a different lecture hall because for some reason I've been moved to a different room for the day. All I need is an internet connection and I can ask these questions of the students. For students, they don't need to buy that hardware clicker anymore. They can have a web browser open on their laptop, their tablet. They can have an iPhone app or an Android app to download this Top Hat thing. And one of the sort of fears was that students might not be bringing this technology into class, and this is something that also was sort of, I'm just piloting using this system for one semester. But there weren't really very many complaints about suddenly I need to bring my phone to class. Students were already using smartphones almost exclusively, or just about every student had a smartphone, and there was no problem having them bring that to class. If anything, they were like, suddenly I don't need to bring this hardware clicker anymore. That's something that I might be using. Sometimes, I might forget my clicker, but I never forget my phone, is a comment that a student sort of gave me. Another problem potentially was the cost again. Students already had these hardware clickers. They were already using them in the first year, and suddenly I was saying, you need to spend an extra 20 bucks on this thing that you might not see much value in, and you can't resell it. After the semester is over, that $20 is spent. You don't get to use the system again. You essentially rented the system for that period of time. And as it turned out in the data later on, this became a major problem for the students. Biggest feature, the biggest sort of improvement over the hardware clickers was many different question types. I think they've got 7 different question types right now. Still multiple choice and true false, as you might expect, but they can do matching questions. I can give them definitions and terms and have them match one to the other. Sorting questions, if I talk about the process of doing a gram stain, I can put all the steps up in a list and have them sort them in order to see if they can get it correct. Numerical questions, with BMSE 240, we go over various sort of solution chemistry and buffer calculations and things like that, enumeration of bacteria. So I'm teaching them these calculations, and then I'm asking them to answer it in a multiple choice format. And the students don't need to think about the answer. They might just click something because, well, I'm supposed to answer this question. I want to get that attendance mark. I'll just click whatever. But suddenly, if it's a numerical answer, they need to think through the question, generate their own answer, and submit that. Text responses, it could be a single word. It could be a paragraph if you wanted to sort of collect that from all the students. Clicking on image is sort of a fun one where you can upload various pictures and have sort of, identify the whatever anatomical structure, identify this particular bacteria, or, in this case, here, can't really read the question, but, they're supposed to indicate where the mannitol fermenting bacteria were, and you can see that they really didn't know what the answer was because there was only one of those 3 plates that was the mannitol salt agar, and only half of the plate right here actually was the correct place to answer, but students try, and that's a nice way to say, I can see you clicked on this one. Why is this an incorrect answer? And you can sort of have that, refreshing their knowledge and reinforcing the correct thing. So some of the questions that I was using with the clickers immediately translated to Top Hat. It was just, it's a multiple choice question, I'm going to use a multiple choice question again, and there was no sort of added benefit to using this software system. Some questions I adapted. I actually went from sort of a limited set of answers, and in this question it's essentially how long can you be immune to something after you've been infected or after you've been vaccinated against it. And I had to come up with these answers because I wasn't sure what the answers the students might think of. And I was just, Let's pick some short numbers, let's pick some high numbers that might be an entire lifespan, and look to see what students give. But this adapted sort of example is I essentially uploaded this number line, and the students could give me any numerical answer they wanted. And rather than just seeing a list of numbers, it gives me this heat map showing really where their thoughts are and sort of overlays them. So you can see, lots of students figured 20 to 25 years you'd stay immune for something, and then another sort of large group of students figured 100 years you might be immune to something, or essentially your entire lifespan. And then there were the good questions, the ones where they aren't only selecting a response, but they're generating their own response. And this is probably one of the biggest advantages of using this software-based system. So here we've got a buffer calculation. Essentially, it is the exact same question on the left and right side. Here, they had to pick an answer, and I'm sure you've all, if you've ever made a multiple choice question, you need to say, what's the correct answer? What is a potentially correct answer if you make this particular mistake, or if you have this misunderstanding in your knowledge, so that students might pick it? And then what is a couple random answers that students might come up with, and who knows what they might actually generate? Whereas once students needed to think about it, more students were actually generating the correct answers. And I could also see that, what were the various sort of problem areas? What were the various answers that students were giving that aren't ones that I was coming up with? And I could analyze those and say, oh, you answered this because you just submitted it as a decimal instead of a percent, or you actually made a mistake in your understanding. And those are sort of things that I could never detect when it was just a multiple choice response. So the students were surveyed when they were using the clickers at the end of term, when they were using Top Hat at the end of term, and I started using it one more time once the site license went through. And this was because looking at the data for the system where students had to pay for it, I felt that it might be negatively skewed because of the cost. And essentially, I went to Gwenda Moss and had some help with survey design and ethical approval and things like that. But started off with this sort of simplistic question. The student response system used in class, so whichever one they'd been using, was useful for learning material, increased engagement in the lectures, increased interactivity in class, deepened my understanding of the material, increased my confidence in the material, and then an area for comments. And to sort of summarize the data, what we can see is that for every metric used, going from hardware clickers to Top Hat that they paid for, Top Hat that they paid for to Top Hat that was free, every single place except for this one here, there was a statistically significant increase in their sort of how they valued it for their learning, or how they valued it for their engagement in the lectures. And just to drill down for one of these to show sort of where the sort of various responses were, you can see that when we were using the hardware-based clickers, the most students, or about half of the students, agreed that using clickers gave them a better understanding of the material. A lot of students, however, were neutral, or sort of saying, that doesn't really help me understand the material at all, doing these multiple choice questions. Once we went to this Top Hat paid system, suddenly there were a lot more students who strongly agreed with that statement, about as many who agreed, but it was really more the students who went from 3 to 4, some of the students go from 4 to 5, and once the system was free, it expanded even more. More students are satisfied with using this system, gives them a better understanding, increases their engagement in the material. Another thing we're doing is comment analysis. So looking at the initial comments of the second term, or the first term that I used Top Hat, the one that I had to pay for, just a little over a third of the comments talked about cost. I wish I didn't have to pay $20. Why aren't we using the hardware system? It's free. I already bought that. This stinks that, I don't get my value after the semester's over. Whereas, and that's the whole reason that I decided to survey the students for a third semester where Top Hat became a site licensed. And once it was free, a third of the comments that came back said, it's so great that we're using this system that I don't need to pay for. It's already built into my tuition, campus is using it. So if you can use this system, you aren't going to have any problems with students saying, oh, but I don't have a device, or oh, it's something I need to pay for. They are able to use this with very few difficulties. Students also in their comments said, I appreciate that you can ask more question types. I can actually think about these responses, submit, my answer to a calculation. Another great thing that the students highlighted was that because it's web-based, after, before the midterm or before the final, every single question that I asked in class is available on that one web page. I can mark questions as homework, or I can mark them as review so that they can do them again. I can add additional questions into the system where I don't need to have this sort of put up on Blackboard in a way that it can't get marked and things like that. So it's just a more robust system by pretty much every metric. So other things you might sort of think about going from this hardware system to a software system, you might say, well, it sounds like it's going to take longer. Students need to take out their phone, they need to actually log into the app, or they need to log into the website. And what I found going through 2 terms of lecture videos, timing out every single question that I asked and how long the students took to answer, was that there was an increase in the amount of time the students took to answer questions, but it wasn't hugely substantial. From 98 seconds per question to 132 questions per second, if you can't dedicate 132 seconds in the middle of your lecture to asking the students a question and having them generate a response, or at least adding that extra 34 seconds to having them really think about it and generate a response, I can't see why you wouldn't think that that's worthwhile. With the hardware system, everything was multiple choice. When I started using the software system, only a quarter of the questions were, which meant that 3/4 of them, they had to generate and really think about those types of questions. The big thing that I saw was that in calculation questions, I could have, in some questions, I would give students 4 to 5 minutes to answer it, and they were still submitting answers. With the multiple choice calculations, it really never went beyond 2 minutes, because once students had been sitting there for 2 minutes, they started to say, you know what, a lot of people have answered already. I'm not done this calculation. I'm worried that we might move on. I'm going to answer something even though it's not the answer that I've come up with. So giving them time, having them generate a response really gets them to think about the material. The other great thing was that suddenly I could ask more and diverse questions. So I went from asking a little over 1 question per lecture to about 1.5. And if I looked at what I'm doing now, it's probably even a little higher from there, because I see more places where I can ask this diversity of questions, and it's not all multiple choice. Cost, we didn't expect, or I didn't expect to have such a negative impact, but obviously, once it was free, suddenly the students appreciated the system a lot more. And, just overall, students appreciated this new system. There were very few students who had any complaints about it. This study, the second study, is currently being written up, and hopefully it'll be submitted at the end of the summer for publication. Right now we're doing more in-depth comment analysis, sort of categorizing for things. Is this a sort of, the students made them think, it gave them an incentive to come to class, were there technological issues and things like that. Another thing I want to look at is learning outcomes, and I actually think that the best way of doing this might be to ask, while I was showering this morning, I just came up with a new way to study this. I think what I might do is have some calculation questions that are multiple choice and some calculation questions that are open-ended where they need to submit their answer, and actually look to see, do students perform better on one versus the other, and then on the midterm or on the final, does that reflect a sort of permanent gain in performance? Because this way I don't need to swap from one system to the next, I can actually swap from one question type to the next. If you want to talk about best practices using any student response system, give them some kind of grade. So if you want students to use it, you need to make it worthwhile. It's very obvious if there's no grade dedicated to it, the students don't want to use the system. They aren't going to buy into it. Also, things are going to go wrong. Students are going to forget their clicker. Students are going to have their phone die. The Wi-Fi is going to be dead. About a year ago, at one point, I was lecturing, everything seemed fine. I went to present a question and it just stalled. Turned out the East Coast Amazon web servers, which fed half the internet, were being attacked by some whatever hacker group. And essentially the whole internet was down. And students who showed up or students who didn't, nobody emailed me to say, I missed that class or did we use clickers, because I build in absences into the system. Essentially how it works for me, for my class, is that any student who has more than 80% attendance gets full marks. That way I don't need to deal with every single I was sick or my hardware wasn't working, my phone wasn't charged. Last thing, I guess 2 things. try every feature. You never know what you're going to like or what you're not going to like. This image one, I wasn't sure I'd be too much of a fan of, but even just clicking on a number line, there's sort of this robustness of the sort of answers that I can generate or collect from the students. And if you're worried about delays, every single time I use a top hat question, I put a little marker like this at the bottom of the slide, letting the students know, I go into this slide, probably going to take 3-4 minutes to work my way through it. They know that when I reach the end of this slide, there's going to be a top hat question, so they already have their phone out. They're already ready to answer, so it really cuts down that delay. Some future studies that I'm thinking about, I've only got a couple of minutes here. We now have some of the academic programming appointments and some of the other sort of educator people in the College of Medicine have produced the biomeducation cluster. And we've been funded for 2 years from Gwen and Moss, $5,000 a year, not a lot, but for social studies research, goes sort of a long way. Doing this clicker data sort of analysis doesn't cost a lot of anything. There's no reagents to buy and things like that. But what we're looking at is planning into the future when we go to our new departmental model and our new 3 programs. We're going to have this opportunity to survey the students of how effective was our old program and how effective is our new program. And we want to actually look at this because we want to show that this has been designed to better prepare students for grad school or better prepare students for medicine or wherever they're going. Another thing that I'm quite excited about is that the lecture viewage data from Blackboard is terrible. And I've wanted for probably the last 4 or 5 years, I've wished that there was a way to know what part of the video each student is viewing. Are they only watching the first 5 minutes of review? Are they watching, 38 minutes in when we're doing the restriction digest because that's something that they really need re-explained to them? And when I was advising ICT on their new lecture capture system, 2 of the 3 systems that they looked at have built-in minute-by-minute analytics. So you can see essentially a graph of, if this is the total video time, something like this, and then maybe it drops off, and then maybe you've got this peak here, and you'd say, well, what was the content I was delivering in that part of the lecture? Students seem to think it's really important. Is it really important for them to review because I didn't explain it well enough? Is it just me going over a calculation and they want to go through it again? But I think this is a great way to have that iterative feedback of, at the end of the semester, I can look to see, what did students review the most often? Should I be teaching that in a different way so that it's more understandable? Or should I just be spending more time on that content? And that's something that I want to study once we move on to this new system, which hopefully should be in the fall. Acknowledgements, Gwen and Moss Center for Teaching and Learning, or used to be Gwen and Moss Center for Teaching Effectiveness, for really any people who want to teach better or have better sort of knowledge, which is the background of, the sort of scholarship of teaching and learning. It's not just you telling, regurgitating content and your students trying to remember it all. What are the best practices for teaching? So the various seminars and workshops that I've been to over the years, them for funding the bioeducation cluster for 2 years, Carolyn from Gwen and Moss for helping me with survey design and ethics approval, bioeducation cluster, which is 3 of the AP appointments in the College of Medicine now. We'll see if we can get Stan and Paul, if they want to join. I'll get all the AP positions in here. Also Greg Caliani and Marcel with their sort of various educational background. And my colleagues in the Department of Biochemistry. When I first came here, I was in the Department of Physiology. And quickly it was decided that Kyle should be either in micro or biochem. And biochem was just very welcoming and brought me into their home. And thank you. And that's it for today. 11:30. I hit the hour on the dot.
Any questions for that? Comments?
Yes.
I've been here for 5.5 years. That's the first time I hear about this and of your improvements. So my question is, how do you, is it, or what you described is for improving your own lecture time or actually, and the research that you've done, or is it to kind of help other people and provide useful information to other within the, say, at least the Department of Biochemistry, which is your house?
Yeah. And it's really sort of when you're first starting to use new things and stuff like that, you're trying to figure out, and you're not sure if you've got that sort of level of expertise. But I've sort of built up my knowledge that Gwen Moss has asked me to put on, or at least co-present some things on using Top Hat and things like that. So as much as I haven't really sort of drilled into my colleagues in biochemistry of these are things that you should use in your teaching, because I'm not quite certain if they want that. But I think that I should probably be more open and say, if anyone's thinking about using clickers, come talk to me. I'll help you get set up. I'll walk you through it and show you how to use them.
Probably I'm not even aware of a lot of
Yeah.
things. So, and then, as I say, you've done a lot of things that you presented here, and I haven't heard about it. And, there's when I'm Moss, they do their thing. I don't know how much people actually go there and learn, possibly young, new assistant professors do, but other people don't. So, to my mind, all what you said, the value is in, beyond your own teaching, is in kind of letting people aware. Not to tell them you have to do it this way. Show them what the options, possibilities are. And that's what I kind of messing with.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess I've sort of thought, well, Gwen Moss gives teaching workshops on how to use lecture capture, how to use clickers, how to use whatever it might be. And, faculty are always available to go do that, but I guess we could do more to sort of, put ourselves out there and say, these are things that people in your department are using, and, they're shown to be effective. They're shown to, increase engagement in the class or increase the attendance, have better learning outcomes. And yeah. That's why I also wanted to dedicate or sort of focus on this stuff today, because I thought this is a great opportunity to have a number of faculty here to sort of give them essentially my pitch of you should be using more technology in your teaching because it can assist you.
I have a question sort of about the methodology of the first research paper. So you showed a graph that linked attendance with success.
Yeah.
Basically. I guess my question is, have you control for how well those students are doing overall in other courses? Because it could be just students who aren't as smart don't attend so much. The smart ones do. Like, I mean, it could be there's a pre-existing thing that has nothing to do with you.
Yeah, definitely. And that's something where I wanted to see how much useful data I could pull out from the courses that I previously taught. But because I didn't have essentially ethical approval to pull their transcripts, look at how well they did in BMSC 200 or 230 or something like that and correlate it, with the second study I actually had students opt in with their NSIDs, saying that I'm going to be using this to correlate how you feel about the response system, your responses with the system, and your grade potentially in other courses. So
that was included, or that?
in the second study, I have that permission from the students, and that's part of the analysis that's ongoing now. But with the initial stuff, yeah, because it might be that students are opting out, and those are the ones who are going to fail anyway, and those are the ones who just never show up to class, right, regardless of what the system is.
I have a question about Top Hat. I will be using it in August, and I'm just wondering if it allows you to monitor individual students, and like how easy is it to add a class? Because I know they are all listed in Blackboard, but do you have to add individual students to the list, or?
No, so you can actually, once you get your course list, so in sort of instructor services, you can download the course list, which has a list of all the students and all their email addresses. You can essentially cut and paste that to Top Hat, and it sends an email out inviting all of those students to join the course that you've set up. And also, because it is a site-licensed paid system, they're very helpful if you have any problems with setting stuff up. I've never had more than maybe a 5-minute wait of, I need to transfer my old course that I've taught to another copy so I can teach it for this next semester and reuse the same questions. And there's always people online ready to give you assistance with that. But if you have any sort of need for in-person help, come see me. You've TA'd for me. No.
Just curious, so you should be good at sort of attendance for the student who attended more to have a higher mark. But on the other hand, the video viewing, the student who viewed more, there's no correlation at all.
Yeah.
So how do you sort of look at that?
So the problem with the sort of viewing statistics with Blackboard is that it's very limited in the data that you can get. So all I can get essentially is that a student clicked on the link to open the video. But it doesn't tell me how much of the video that they watched. It doesn't tell me if, they've got a bad connection, so they had to restart their computer and they didn't actually watch it. Essentially, it's just clicks being counted there. Whereas the new system that we're going to be adopting, or at least there's a 66% chance that one of the two new systems that we might adopt have that built in, so I can see how much of the video that they were viewing. And that's something that, yeah, I really want to be able to sort of get that data set. Actually, a few years ago, I looked at a commercial video hosting sort of service who could do that minute by minute sort of analytics, but I couldn't really sort of justify the cost of using that because it wasn't something that I would be passing on to the students. It'd be something that I would have to use like my professional development money for, and I was like, you know what? I don't quite need it yet. Hopefully we'll use a system at some point that can have that type of useful data.
Thank you for your talk. Very nice. Do you know if there was a correlation or a negative correlation between attendance and use of the videos?
I didn't really want to drill down into that because I wasn't sure, other than number of clicks, how many views each student was getting. And just the Blackboard data is rudimentary at the sort of level of sort of quality of hits that you're getting off of that. So it's something that I would want to look at is, are the students who are higher performing using the videos less because they don't need it? Are the students who, need that extra assistance, who, maybe if I could look at their grade coming in from a previous course, are those the ones who rely more heavily? Another thing I would like to look at, and could potentially sort of, if I'm building that into the study, is look at students who are English as a second language. Are they re-accessing the videos because it's their opportunity to slow it down and pause it and really, do that translational work that they need to do as they're attending the lecture?
Do you think that live lectures looking 10, 20 years in the future are going to be replaced by really well-designed online materials?
I think that looking at, just the experience the students get with the videos that I post versus coming to lecture, the students who come to lecture do better. So I don't think we'll ever completely substitute face-to-face lecturing and instruction with everything online. But what we might do is go to more of a flipped system where these are the lecture videos, and a few times a week I essentially have a seminar where students come. If they want any reinforcement, if they want me to go over anything, I can teach to only the students who are showing up in class, whereas all the stuff they really need to know has already been posted online. And I can see that becoming a system that we sort of transition into.
I just want to add to that comment. I sort of think that your data might be skewed. Like the ones that come to lecture do better. You said the ones that view the videos, there's no correlation.
Mm-hmm.
The ones that view the videos might be the ones that they're not as good as students.
Mm-hmm.
They're distracted all the time when they're viewing stuff. And so the ones that go to lecture might not be the ones that are viewing the material, so they're doing well. And there's a correlation. But the ones that are viewing the videos are the ones that are going to do poor anyways, and it might be too weak a correlation to actually benefit from it. So if the best students were actually viewing the videos and not going to lectures or whatever, there might be a correlation between that video.
And another thing that I don't really have a handle on is that if students have opted out of the clicker usage, they might still be coming to some of the lectures. And I'm not actually collecting that data because I'm not using a sort of secondary attendance system, circulating a sheet to see who's showing up to class. So it might be that if I banned the students who weren't using the clickers from showing up, maybe they would do even worse. Maybe I'd actually be able to sort of separate these two populations a little bit better. But obviously I don't want to do that because I want them all to learn in the best way possible.
Any other questions?
I'm just wondering, when you're using the lecture capture software, is it just your screen, or do you have one like this camera looking at you?
So there's actually been some literature, and it's one of the things that I sort of learned about when I was at Gwinnett, where you can, using Camtasia Studio, have the webcam also record your face, and essentially it's the sort of talking head, like, having it off in the corner and things like that. And what I was sort of informed of is that most students do not really appreciate that, because essentially you're blocking part of the screen, having that, continual hard-coded image of your face talking, and there's not a lot of useful information. I mean, yes, in communication, body language is really important, but if you're, looking at this lecture video, it's really what I say and what I draw and what's being projected that people are the most focused on. The systems that the university is looking at accommodating actually have the ability to have side-by-side video. So it could record with the webcam you and record what's being projected on the screen. And the students can then toggle having them picture-in-picture, having them side-by-side, just looking at one. And in that case, I would be more willing to actually have that video of me always being recorded. The other thing is that if I move out of frame, you're sort of thinking, well, should I always be staying in frame then? Because that way everyone's getting that sort of experience. Or should I still be free to move around the class if I'm trying to sort of demonstrate something?